good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Times of COVID. Today's guest today is, I think, probably very well known to you all. Rob Wallace is an evolutionary epidemiologist with Agroecology and Rural Economics Research Corps. He's the author of Dead Epidemiologists, Big Farms Make Big Flu, and co-author of Clear-Cutting Disease Control, Capital-Led Deforestation, Public Health, Austerity, and Vector-Borne Infection. He has consulted with the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He's a founder member of the Pandemic Research for the People, who authored a recent Daraja Press book, Moving Beyond Capitalist Agriculture, Could Agroecology Prevent Further Pandemics? Welcome, Rob. This is the third time over the last 18 months that I've interviewed you, so thank you for being so kind to accommodate me on this. What provoked me to ask you to come and join us on the show again is a really interesting piece that you put together entitled Don't Look Up, COVID's Infectious Period, which is available from your Patreon site. And for this show, what I've done is taken one of your subheadings in that article, Rebellion as Intervention, as something that perhaps we can discuss as we develop this conversation. But as many people may not have yet donated to your Patreon site and therefore haven't read this thing, perhaps you could talk us through why you decided to write this piece and perhaps summarize what the key, and there are many key elements in it, but perhaps the main things that you'd like to start with and draw attention to.
Sure. Thank you for having me. And as we've spoken of before, I did say we should stop meeting like this because I would much prefer that there was no pandemic for us to talk about. And yet here we are entering year 3. And as I'm sure we all are, it's exhausting and terrible. And here we are at a point in which Omicron variant is spreading around the world. Here in the United States, we keep hitting new global records of new cases. This past Monday, we had 1.35 million new cases in a single day. That's probably maybe even not even the total that we have, because we're coming up against our ceiling in terms of testing and the availability of both at home and in hospitals. So, we are getting slammed by another wave of a pandemic we have been alerted to since January 2020. And yet we see here in the United States and elsewhere, even as we have new administrations come to power by dint of saying we're going to do it better. Here in the United States, we have the Biden administration, which is on course to repeat the Trump administration's record of 500,000 dead Americans from COVID by early this spring. The administration came to power based on its intent on actually putting in a plan to deal with the COVID outbreak here. Many of its expectations or marks in the plan were actually quite good, but there was also room for criticism. I wrote those criticisms in November 2020 and in January 2021. However, even the plan that the Biden administration put out, it has since largely abandoned. And we've seen across this year a kind of intent and purposeful backing away from its declarations that it would do something about the outbreak. So this is the reason why I wrote the piece, and this is the third in a series of how we see the kind of broken promises and what that's left here in the States. I try to talk more about when I come on these shows or give interviews or write up pieces. I try to write up in a global perspective. Try to avoid the American narcissism, to just talk about ourselves, as we often do. But in this case, the piece speaks a lot about the United States because in my view, the ruling class here, the political class here, are basically practicing a means of trying to push forward through continuing capitalist economies at the expense of accepting and embracing that we have to live with COVID, even if it includes rolling up record numbers of hospitalizations and deaths.
So, I mean, Omicron has really burst into the US and indeed internationally. Why? What's happened? And is this something? Is this just an incident, or is it something that we're going to see the emergence of successful variants emerging that could either be more infectious or more infectious and more virulent? What's happening?
Well, I mean, we when I say we, I meant the political classes and the ruling classes of countries around the world made the decision to, well, I would say more in the neoliberal ruling classes made a decision to not to let COVID wend its way through various populations in order to keep capitalist economies going. Even to the point of making sure that the pharmaceutical companies that produced the vaccines that were, if not entirely effective, at least certainly kept people from going to hospitals and dying, to make sure that, in fact, they would not be available on the global scale. And although the Biden administration here has spoken out in favor of kind of walking back the kind of WTO TRIPS rules on protecting intellectual property rights. Here, effectively, the Bill Gates of the world, and in combination with the pharmaceutical companies, are in effect the American foreign policy when it comes to COVID. And they were able to force the World Health Organization from moving from a open medicine model, meaning all the vaccines and intellectual property would be available to everyone, so that we can develop vaccines everywhere around the world. They moved away from that model to one in which the pharmaceutical companies were to accept to give vaccines to the 20% of the poorest populations in the low-income countries. That has all since fallen apart, and now it's still very much a mad scramble where the richest countries of the world are able to not only get the first 2 shots of the various vaccines, but also now the boosters. So what that does, to answer your question, is that basically opens up the entire world to allowing a virus to circulate and experiment with through its evolutionary space to figure out different ways to not only solve the human immune system, but to solve the very vaccines that they've denied much of the world. So we're going to see we're going to see a series of new variants, one after the other. And as they experiment more through the evolutionary space, they're going to figure out new ways by which to infect people faster. And we have a situation where Omicron, which ostensibly isn't as virulent as, say, Delta and some of the early variants, actually can kill more people by virtue of infecting more people. So here in the United States, even though we have access to vaccine, we have 84 million Americans who don't have any vaccination whatsoever. So that certainly opens up, we have our own contributions to make in terms of the evolution of new variants. And we're likely to be caught in this process for many of years going forward.
But the argument that CDC and others put forward is that, well, we just let it be, because then, is that a viable public health measure?
No, it's a eugenicist model. It's a notion that people with comorbidities that are likely to die from this can die from it, and as long as it spreads around. Even I think the last time we talked about the presumptive nature of the idea of herd immunity, that if we're all infected or we're vaccinated, then we can have a certain level of immunity that would protect people, even those who haven't been vaccinated. And it is proving time and time again that that's not to be the case for COVID-19. Repeatedly, you have populations that have a high combination of infecteds and vaccination in whom the outbreak continues to churn on. in part because the variants evolve out from underneath immunity. The vaccines themselves are only effective for a certain amount of time, and vaccine effectiveness is slowly starting to fall out of the sky. That's why, in part, they have brought out the booster. And so, in effect, that notion is an impossible objective, but also consciously going for trying to make sure people are infected is basically saying that a goodly portion of every population, we are willing to accept that their deaths. It could be people above a certain age. It could be people with a variety of illnesses. All the damage that comes out of that, in addition, the kind of the long COVID infections where people feel ill for years on end with debilitating illnesses that come along after the COVID infection has left their body. So this is not an idea that's supported either epidemiologically or as in any way, in any moral sense of what is right in the world.
But I mean, it's interesting you use the term a eugenicist approach, and it seems to me that that model is something being replicated not just in the US but in internationally, and everyone talks about a global apartheid in relation to their access to vaccines. But isn't it true that in many countries there's an internal apartheid? There are, for example, where I come from in Kenya, the middle classes all have access to. They can privately access vaccinations. The rest is just simply not available. Do you want to comment on that internal apartheid, and to what extent is it manifested also in the US?
That's right. So there's a key concept in social epidemiology that pathogens spread through societies like ice, like water spreads through cracks in ice. And so the pathogens are in essence following the paths of least resistance and moving into populations that are most susceptible, typically the poorest, typically the most oppressed. And, in the first year, the various ruling classes were worried that they too would be infected, to the point that some of these countries rolled out social programs that would, in essence, try to not only protect some of the poorest, but also by dint of that, protect the richest who could also be infected. But now with vaccines and now with accumulating data, that's the poorest and the oppressed who are hit hardest by this. There's a growing divide emerging in the US and elsewhere, as you brought up, that we can survive this. And so as those who have access to vaccines, you might get infected and be badly ill. Like a mild Omicron infection is not mild. Like it's bad. It's not good. But you won't end up in the hospital likely, and you won't die. So it unfortunately gives courage to our various political classes and bourgeoisie, to use the old term, that are willing and able to try to push on through, meaning they're prepared to sacrifice a certain proportion of the population along the way in order to keep a system that has been in place for hundreds of years, but certainly has in the last several decades, particularly on the dawning of the neoliberal era, you have an increasing divide between poor and rich. And that divide, of course, accelerated even during the outbreak itself. So the outbreak is not only a manifestation of that divide, but actually a mechanism by which that divide is accelerated and or made larger. So yes, to answer the answer is yes. These divides are both felt at multiple levels, geographic organization. We have the classic divide between global North and global South. And of course, we have these divides that are recapitulated within individual countries, both within the global North and within the global South.
Right. Let me just build on this idea that there's a sort of eugenic attitude Is it not true that this precedes the emergence of this particular pandemic? In that, if one looks at the healthcare systems across the world, they have been systematically underfunded,
Right.
reduced capacity, and in many cases, with the intention of selling it off for a song. Um, wasn't that part of that eugenicist thinking?
Well, yeah. I mean, the here in the United States, you had an abandonment of public health, what little there was post World War II, with the dawning of neoliberalism, and what public health there was either abandoned or sold off, and so public health became a matter of you and your relationship with your doctor. And the notion of a shared commons that extends beyond our resources, but to our shared health, was largely let to slip aside because a lot of money could be made off commoditizing health as an individualized exercise, that each person's responsible for their health. Each person, if you want to be healthy, you can buy it, and you have to buy it in a marketplace. And, that is a kind of classic Malthusian vantage point of these things, and built in already, and, resulting in the deaths of multi-millions of people, at the global level, along the equator in the global south, but within our countries, the global north, we have various global souths. Here in the U.S., we have the South Bronx, we have the South Side of Chicago, we have South Los Angeles. So we have those things recapitulated. Yeah, what was that?
And the indigenous populations as well.
Most definitely. And so you had, on the annual, millions of people in these situations killed by preventable diseases and chronic infections and chronic conditions, as a way of keeping a system of expropriation on its path, both globally and within each country.
I love the quote that you included from the nurses saying, don't use euphemisms like hospital beds when what you actually mean is nursing staff. The hospitals have not run out of furniture. I think that's such a precise and great way of expressing it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about the piece is that, throughout the piece, I have a variety of quotes from, all sorts of people. Yes, epidemiologists, radical epidemiologists, but everyday people, comedians, nurses. I think upon here in the U.S., when the Biden administration basically declared that it wouldn't pick up the bill for a rapid antigen test, or you would have to pay out of pocket first, and maybe they'll get back to you about it. And also when they said that it would reduce the recommended quarantine rates from 10 days to 5 on behalf of the employer class, including a letter written by the Delta Airlines CEO saying, "Could you do this for us?" And they snapped to it in a matter of days. I mean, the response to it is withering, and it comes across political vantage point, and all sorts of people and all sorts of lines of work and social classes are truly upset about this. And the administration here is two things: either they have a tin ear about what's going on and cannot hear what's going on the street and the reaction toward, or they do not care, because this has been part of a year-long push to reverse kind of social services that allow people to shelter in place and instead push them back into the workplace. So we have the end of the Paycheck Protection Program. You have the end of the expanded unemployment benefits. You have the end of the federal eviction moratoriums. We have the end of the kind of monthly checks for families that have children. And all that was being torn aside across this whole past year. And knowing that the Delta variants of the world were emerging, and very clear that Omicron, what it was all about, and still pushing that program, indicates that they were very clear on understanding what the the fallout of all this would be, and that would be many sick people, many hospitalized, and many dead.
Yeah, we have a comment from Peter Stakov saying many economies will not survive in their current form because of long COVID. What's your view of that?
Well, there is, the notion is the administration is entirely focused on their long-term thinking is about getting the economy running, and that was clear all the way back to that phone call that Biden and Trump shared in April 2020. It was a cordial phone call, and it was almost, although there was no transcript of it, it was almost so obviously clear that the notion of we need to take care of COVID to get the economy going. And so that the economy front and center is the only kind of long-term vision they have of things. But for the most part, they're only thinking about short-term damage. And they're thinking of, well, how many people are going to are we missing from hospitals? How many people are, if children have to stay at home, then how many people can't go to work? And so they are trying to bend and force people back into the labor market and back to work in order to keep the economy going, and understanding that there is going to be a considerable amount of damage. They talk about having the tools, and they speak about vaccines and rapid antigen tests. Both are problematic. Both are crumbling. Both are falling out of the sky as programs. But there are also all sorts of other tools that we were just describing, all the social programs that would protect people from being infected. But their objective is to get people back to work and dam the torpedoes and all the damage, including the long COVID thing, which is a silent and deadly secret. It basically brings up the distrust that people have for the medical system. If you remember all the different many years of doctors just trusting their own patients when they reported if they got Lyme disease or any of the long-term manifestations of acute infections or chronic infections, and we have a growing cry out, growing organizing among people who are suffering long COVID, and the extent of the damage to that is not quite clear at this point. But I think Peter's point is a very important one: is that when you are trafficking in multi-millions of people infected, even if it's a small proportion who get long COVID, that's still a very large number. And that, of course, eats away at the costs of the capacity of a society to have to take care of people. But it isn't just about monetary costs, right? It's the utter disregard for humanity and the damage and suffering that people undergo under both short infections and this terrible long COVID.
Right. One of the things we're seeing here in Quebec is the demonization of the unvaccinated. That is to say, that's the solution. It's their fault that the health services are over subscribed, falling apart. What's your view on that?
Well, one can understand the feeling of frustration that, why don't people just get vaccinated? And one can be very angry at the kind of right-wing kind of talk show hosts who basically are encouraging their listeners not to get vaccinated. And one can, I think I wrote in the piece that even celebrate the ironic deaths of some of these right-wing hosts from COVID itself, given what they've done to their own listeners. But I think it is a Biden talking point to, and also elsewhere, as you described, in other countries, to blame the unvaccinated for the suffering that has happened both to them individually and by virtue of taking hospital beds to other people who aren't able to access medical care. But the problem is that the failure to institute the kind of non-pharmaceutical interventions in year one, basically the Tetris program, right? Contact tracing, isolation, And those things weren't followed up on. And the apparatus, the infrastructure one needs to get that to work wasn't instituted. So what we could have done is we could have hired 1 million or 2 million community health workers to go door to door to make sure people are okay, to make sure that they're not suffering from the isolation involved in sheltering in place, make sure all their needs are taken care of. If someone's suffering from COVID, make sure they have access to emergency care. And this is the kind of building of trust that's necessary. And there would be many people who would be opposed to some of these interventions. But you knock on the guy's door, they tell you to go fuck off, and then you come back another day, and you keep working on them, and you build trust so that you can have communication. So this would be for any intervention, whether it's a non-pharmaceutical interventions, whether it's the pharmaceutical inventions that eventually would come around, whether they're vaccines or drugs. But you have to build trust. There has to be trust between government and community, and there have to be trust between community and the medical establishment. And that has been all destroyed, in fact, by virtue of some of the things we talked about earlier, a kind of neoliberalization of the healthcare system. Even under Obamacare here, we have something like 44 million Americans who don't have healthcare, 28 million more Americans who are underinsured. So they've been cut off out of a health system that would ostensibly would be able to be taken care of. And so I've spoken about this in other forums along the lines of that the American people and peoples around the world have been largely abandoned by their governments. And so the kind of conspiracy theories, the kind of vaccine skepticism are part of an abandonment of the abandonment, meaning the people of these countries are saying, I've been abandoned and now I have to find my way some other way. So we have kind of folklore, medicine, conspiracy theories that help explain things. So the failure here is that, vaccine skepticism and vaccine hesitancy are also markers of a failure of vaccine access. So it isn't just the needle. You have to reach out to people, build trust, explain to them what the vaccine is, what it does. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of resources that some of the richest countries in the world refuse to do pay as a matter of principle, because governance is now organized around the billionaire class rather than helping the people that are ostensibly the constituency of these governments.
I mean, that raises this question. All the guest is can the vaccine capacity of China, India, Russia, even Cuba affect the global apartheid? But it reminds me of also Bill Gates' view that there isn't a capacity, that all these nations around the world don't know how to make a decent vaccine. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, there was a report by Doctors Without Borders that basically identified 120 plus factories around the world, many in India, but elsewhere, in China, elsewhere, who are perfectly capable of producing mRNA viruses. This very much falls in the face and against Bill Gates' naked declarations that these vaccines could not be done elsewhere. He's just protecting the pharmaceuticals companies' capacity to make a fortune off these vaccines. So of course, it was brought up Cuba as another possibility. So indeed, this would be a way to get out from underneath the global apartheid of vaccines, but requires both the resources and the intellectual property to be shared across so that they can be made safely around the world. So we can do that if we choose to do that, and our ruling classes choose not to do that.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment from Anna Brown. What would a robust system of public health look like? We've been starved of such a system, and not being in the field, I have a hard time even imagining what it looks like.
That's an excellent question, Anna. And we have been so brutalized by a decline in expectations that we've lost the memory of what a public health system actually looks like. And one of the pieces I cite in the Patreon piece there is a report by a group called the Pandemic Think Tank. They do include my parents, but also other folk. You have social psychiatrists, you have epidemiologists, you have a doctor, you have a county official, you have a variety of people with considerable expertise who go into the kind of history of public health, even in the United States. There was such a thing, and to move away from. Of course, we need good doctors and good hospitals and good medical systems and such, and that is very much an important part of that. But it's been all stripped out to just that. I spoke of the kind of community health workers, and countries elsewhere. Cuba's famous for those, building the trust with people. And this involves all the other things that have the U.S. and elsewhere started putting in year one, the notion of the expanded unemployment benefits and the eviction moratoriums. These are all social interventions that protect people from being ill and from being killed from a circulating outbreak. And there were studies done showing that indeed counties that had more people with health care in their borders actually had fewer COVID hospitalizations and fewer COVID deaths. But also this extended to the eviction moratorium. So once the moratoriums were stripped out state by state, you had hospitalizations increase and deaths increase from COVID. So public health care is fundamentally integrated with notions of social justice and protection. And that is a key element of this, but also the notion of developing neighborhood brigades that can check up on people, make sure they're okay, and to permit the kind of interventions that are able to trickle through in such a way that the vaccine can be a very important part of a public health intervention, but requires the kind of the infrastructure and social contact networks that are organized by local jurisdictions, such in a way that that should a vaccine come about, or that it can be administered to people throughout a neighborhood or county or country. One of the things is one of the terrible outcomes of the kind of focus on kind of commodities is the notion that commodities are alone, or what would shock, say, a time traveler from the Stone Age to come and see what we're about. But in fact, and this is a point that Jahi Chappelle, the agroecologist, the political agroecologist, brought up, and when in point in fact, such a time traveler here would be shocked by our social systems, our capacity to organize ourselves into many millions, and that and the capacity for us many millions to take care of each other by virtue of our ability to organize ourselves into in ways that we can take care of ourselves. So we do have firefighting services, we do have hospitals, we do have things that are the kind of the pointed edge of the kind of the emergency first responders to being able to take care of ourselves. But that extends into kind of the secondary and tertiary responses of, getting people, driving people to get up their annual checkups. And that is the social structure that has largely fallen away and led to the kind of distrust that people have when they feel abandoned.
I mean, I think this one of the important points that you make in your paper, and that is the undermining of communities. whether it's community district level, or whether it's unions, whether it's other community organizing. Why is that?
Well, what neoliberalism marked was the smashing of those social organizing in the interest of taking what was the social commons and privatizing it and profiting off it. And in the course of doing that, that turned around and smashed those communities that were in which that the social commons were held. And so that led to a destructive individualism that led people to being abandoned if you can't survive COVID, it's your fault, which several administrations running have now imposed upon people, not only as a material reality, but also as a kind of social psychology. And, when you have unions and when you have community groups, and the 19th century socialists and communists actually understood this very well, in that it wasn't just organizing in any one individual factory. That organization extended into the neighborhoods. So if a group of workers went on strike against a factory, you had the chambers of labor organized together to engage in kind of a general strike against that particular factory. And this so scared the bourgeoisie that they developed what are called chambers of commerce, right? Now you remember, what those are, right? Because they're still around. So you have the bourgeoisie very much organized as a class, but you haven't heard of the chambers of labor, right? Those were smashed and they were driven away. So if you want to fight COVID, you build these chambers of labor again, and you center them in their neighborhoods, and you integrate what happens on the factory floor with what happens on the street, and you have a cohesive and synergy of thinking about how working people defend themselves. And that is in two ways, right? One, we force the governments to do what they were supposed to do because they have the economies of scale necessary to do things. But you also have to react along the lines of mutual aid in their neighborhoods. But that involves, coming out from behind our screens. And I'm not being moralistic about it. I look at screens myself. But to build solidarity across working place and neighborhood such that the dangers that are found on the factory floor can be addressed, and the dangers found in our streets, in this case, a worldwide pandemic, can also be addressed. So that was a direct strategy to smash those chambers and to divide and conquer labor by a variety of ways, by consumerism, by race and class, by the notion that one can return to a middle class and live a life along those political lines. And we find, of course, as the world becomes increasingly divided between rich and the rest of us poor, that truly there is no middle class identity so much anymore, although that is, of course, happening elsewhere in some of the emerging economies. But that is the strange place we are, where we have a kind of global South aspect emerging in countries of the global North, while a global North-like classes are emerging in the global South. So, that's where we are. We need to start to organize again along the lines, not only around COVID itself, but as the pandemic think tank paper gets at the pandemics to come. And that requires that kind of solidarity between working people, hopefully what local jurisdictions understand is going on, and the medical system, in this case for the COVID thing. And you have to build a trust and solidarity, and to understand that what the nurse is going through that you quoted is very much related toward what we need elsewhere beyond the hospital. And so that is our task at hand, and that is a very hard work because the political class spent decades and trillions of dollars to smash that organizing.
But it's, they always argue that it's, inadequate funding, but yet the U.S. spends $768 billion on the military for the Pentagon, more than that was actually requested. The thing I'd like to just highlight in your report, in your article, is how public institutions are coming under the influence of corporations. I mean, the Center for Disease Control, internationally it's recognized as, very expert and so on. Yet, and ironically, it's Delta Airlines that then persuades them for a particular public policy, which has absolutely no basis on epidemiology or science. How does that happen?
Well, it sometimes, as I'm in my middle age, I unfortunately start to see the notion of character as destiny. It's not always true, but what happens in one's childhood does have an impact on who you are as an adult. It's true. But you see CDC emerging, post World War II and I've spoken about this before, that was on the upcycle of the American cycle of capital accumulation, U.S. building out empire. It doesn't just include hundreds of military bases around the world, but the CDC was acting as, along with the United States, as the guarantor of the world capitalist system, that we will help bourgeoisie around the world continue to make a lot of money and by coming in to clean things up, whether that is a democratically elected government in Iran who needs to be smashed, or whether that's invading countries in Latin America who don't toe the line. But also, CDC was a soft version of that, in the sense of sending experts around the world to try to clean up outbreaks that emerge from the capitalist production of expropriating rainforest or anything else along those lines. Is it a good thing that they stop, emergent pathogens from going pandemic? Yes, but the reasons for that, the background of that is a pretty dark possibility. But on the other side of the cycle accumulation, the U.S. enters its neoliberal phase and starts turning capital back into money. And so that is, in other words, they're cashing out. And so all the social commons become means and mechanism by which to make a buck. And that now extends into even some of the more august institutions, including CDC. And so there was a lot of upset over what Trump did to CDC, and that was really nasty stuff there. But it was going on under Obama as well. And then here we see in very obvious form, in a way that does outrage people across the political spectrum. The various tweets I wrote up or reproduced in the paper really got at it. Some are hilarious and dark in that way, but they are. The Biden administration is doing a very good job of teaching the American people and people around the world about where the state of things are, and that these social institutions that were well respected are now themselves very much in the business of perpetuating a system that causes the outbreak in the first place. So, as you brought up, there's the example of suddenly deciding to, cut back the suggested quarantine for folk who are asymptomatic but exposed from 10 days to 5. And you see the various liberal heroes, such as Anthony Fauci, get on TV and explain the reason why we need to do that is to get people to go to work. So he's this very obvious. I mean, it's almost as if a kind of direct quoting from the letter that the Delta CEO sent the administration. And they did it. There's a turnaround time as a matter of days. They will try to cite various scientific evidence to it for it, but the problem, the argument is along the lines that most new infections come out of the first 5 days, and that if someone's asymptomatic, they can put a mask and go to work. The problem is that most is not all, and that there's a what's called dispersion, meaning variation in when people are infectious. And Omicron is very infectious. It's as infectious as a cold or even measles, and it's deadly as influenza. So this is why the bodies are starting to pile up here, even though ostensibly the hospitalization isn't much. We're just working at an economy of scale here in which people are going to die, even though it's less deadly. So what you do is you're sending people out, even a small portion of them are still infectious in that tail end of their infection. That in essence acts as a means by which to continue the Omicron outbreak, because they're out and about working with people, and at some point they have to take their mask off, even to eat or something. And so there are means and mechanisms by which this suggestion actually continues driving the Omicron outbreak.
I mean, it seems to me what comes across from what you're saying is this level of eugenicist approach, an emphasis on one level of saying it's the individual to sort it out, and it's pouring money into the transnational corporations, the big pharma and so on. Not to say anything about the military, right. Pouring all this money into and depriving everyone. And I think you amongst many have been commenting and critiquing what is happening to show that actually what is happening is governments which simply favor capital at the expense of human life. Okay, I think that story that's coming over and over again, and I think there's very strong arguments in support of that. But what can be done? And to me, the issue is what actions can be taken to try and swing that the other way. Are there possibilities for unions to organize, one-day strikes or whatever? Some public action that says, no, enough of this. Right. Is it possible for organizations like Black Lives Matter, for indigenous organizations to take actions which actually force the debate to expose it as a horror? I mean, eugenicism, eugenics is a horrific, it's the prelude to the genocide, and yet there seems to be very little organizing around that, and I just wonder, what are the possibilities for it?
Right. Well, I'll start off with 2 dark points and then switch to the more what we're trying to do here, which is how do we push back against all that? I wrote in a January piece along the lines of that there's a terrible joke of that Yale is a mutual fund with a campus attached to it. And I worried also that the United States has become a stock market with a country attached to it. And there's the damage of that. I mean, the signaling that you were getting at in terms of the quickness of being able to just dump $768 billion into the Pentagon, which is $24 billion more than Biden asked for, on a dime, as so to speak, while just refusing to pay for the things for the American people to be able to survive a pandemic. I mean, there's no clear signal about what's going on in terms of what this political class thinks and believes, and that's for both parties. And I think that is what's shaking people. That they could see it in Trump, that it would be part of a kind of a rightist affinity for racist and ableist language and action, and that this would fold in the neglect would be part and parcel of that. But to see a Biden administration that campaigned on doing exactly the opposite, and in fact arrive less than a year later at basically some of the same talking points of Trump officials, has been a world shaking for some liberals here in the U.S. And it's like, where do we turn next? If the parliamentary system didn't come through, what do we do? And politics isn't something you do one day a year going into a voting booth. I mean, you should do that as a defensive mechanism, a measure, but it's something you got to do every day. And people, the early days of the outbreak, 2020, we had mutual aid organizing going on, part because of the complete dereliction of federal duties. That has somewhat fallen aside because that's really hard to do through a whole pandemic. But the actions that you speak of, the kind of organizing is starting to take place. I participated in a meeting yesterday in which you had a variety of groups come together to basically start establishing what is a people's CDC. If only to begin with, to declare, well, what should you be doing during the pandemic? Because the 5-day thing is wrong. It's just not supported by the scientific literature. And that is a very damning thing. If you have a people's CDC, what are you saying about the CDC? That it's not for the people. And so the move is to try to establish a means and mechanism by which people can be advised about what they might do based on not only scientific practice, but the social realities of where we are presently. The CDC is also acting on the social realities of things, meaning for the capitalist class, right? They need you back to work. And, what would a people CDC advise? So we're in the early stages of that. Part of that would be a working group to basically push the government to do what it needs to do. And a third working group is what would a zero COVID plan look like on the local level? So are there jurisdictions that are capable of acting on that? So in other words, not only from the first year, you had mutual aid groups. I'm with Pandemic Research for the People. We were putting out dispatches on a semi-regular basis about a variety of topics on both on urban COVID, on rural COVID, on international issues. But this is kind of to inform the public about what's going on and what they should be looking at. But now we're moving in the direction of doing something more forceful in terms of trying to force government to do what it needs to do, to move away from eugenics language, to actually take on this pandemic and not just pretend that all the bodies to be left aside are a price worth paying.
I mean, there's an interesting question here about, you mentioned zero COVID as a strategy. Is this something that's realistic? I mean, Roderick Wallace says, the most dangerous thing is dithering. And yes. We've had 3 years of dithering. And so, is that a realistic strategy?
Well, yes, it is. But we have a largely a liberal class here who have been going to war with China in the various liberal journals, Times. I've seen it elsewhere that describes the hardships of zero COVID in China, and I'm not saying there isn't, because the strategy is along this line. If there are a few cases in a city, they're going to lock down the whole city. So you had a city of 14 million people recently that had 170 cases. They locked down the entire city. And so the reports are about the difficulties of getting food and all that. But they didn't report on the efforts of the Chinese government to actually supply that food and stuff. I'm not a Chinese apologist, by the way. I'm just I've roundly criticized a variety of their policies. But I mean, the proof is in the pudding. And you look at the number of cases they have and the number of COVID deaths. I mean, it's like, it's like nothing. I mean, and you think that is terrible versus the 800,000 deaths approaching. You're moving to 1 million by spring. And you want to compare that with what the Chinese did. Now, a lot of countries did try to do zero COVID over the first year. And many countries were successful in that direction. They were of a wide variety of political platforms and perspectives. You think of New Zealand, you think of South Korea, you think of Iceland, you think of early days Uruguay, you think of Panama, and they did the whole suite of non-pharmaceutical interventions and able to get their caseloads down in a way that people can walk around without masks. You know, and I've spoken about this, the shock of seeing the New Zealand rugby game where people aren't wearing masks, not because they're a bunch of, rightists, skeptics, everything, but because they could, because there wasn't COVID, right? You know, and that's a whole different world, right? I mean, I think we would all like to live that world. And there's an irony in China, which arguably authoritarian, to have greater freedom of people being able to walk around, because if you take care of business at the point of an emerging outbreak, then the rest of the country gets to walk around and do its business. And we didn't do that. We just let things slosh around wave after wave. And, people are going about and doing their business here, but they're getting sick, and we're creeping toward 1 million dead. So it's, I think the proof is very much in the pudding. The problem has been that, and I've written this in another piece, is that those countries that refuse to take care of business, and I think of the neoliberal regimes, the U.S., England, France, and some of the other European countries, they're refusing to do anything, both within country, and the refusal to vaccinate people around the world has led to COVID just continuing to chug along. If it's only something like 300 million infected, and if even that's a tenth off, even if it's really 10 times more than that, let's say 3 billion have already been infected, that still leaves many billions of people who have not been infected yet. So in some ways, we may still be in the early days of the outbreak. The Black Plague in Europe went for 8 years.
8 years.
I remember in early 2020, there was some modeling saying that we would have COVID, the pessimistic models out to 2025. I'm like, oh, no way. But I think we're now seeing that is a distinct possibility, particularly if we have governance dedicated toward economy rather than the actual realities of ecology and epidemiology out there. They aren't able to get those two together. But my last point was that some countries are got exhausted. And in effect, refusal to intervene, in essence, laid siege to countries like New Zealand. And in essence, the neoliberal paradigm acted as a catapult that threw COVID bodies over the walls of these city-states, these countries that were trying to do right. And so their populations got exhausted, and they were pushed more toward opening up, which is now leading to the emergence of COVID in places that had been trying to do the right thing. So this is the kind of the wear and tear of the refusal to engage in the kind of global solidarity that a global pandemic needs. And this is why the work we do in the individual level has to happen also at the global level.
So two questions really to end with. One is, is this dithering, as Roderick puts it, creating the conditions for further viruses, further mutations to take place, which are successful and possibly more virulent?
Yeah, dithering is our scientific program. I mean, it goes back to the emergence of SARS to begin with. I mean, you had epidemiologists of a variety of political stances, not just rads like me. There were, part of the establishment warning that we're going to have a deadly pandemic emerge. And we have a new candidate year after year. And I've spoken about them right since the turn of the century. A lot more have emerged, but we had everything from SARS-1 to MERS to SARS-2, what we're dealing with today, but also a lot of the avian influenzas, the swine flu, H1N1 2009, Ebola from 2013 on, and then again later in the Congo, more Ebola. You have African swine fever that wiped out half of China's hog that could is easily spill over into humans. So, I mean, how much more signals that can you be given to be told that this is real, but we pretended otherwise because the system was so organized around so much profit, and so much profit was being made that to do anything about the damage of such a system was set aside. This is the first of what will probably be a series of pandemics. And, of course, we also have climate change beginning to make its way. I mean, certainly some places have felt this for several decades, but now we begin to move in a direction of mass changes, geological changes that are occurring in historical time. So it is a difficult spot we find ourselves, and it's going to require basically changing everything that we know. And it will require startup from bottom up. But we have to find the courage and fortitude to understand that even as it's a generational project, we are at a point in history that requires organizing together and pushing back against those who are sociopathic enough to be willing to sacrifice millions for a bank account.
So it's not just big farms make big flu, it's big capital makes big flu.
Yeah.
One of the arguments against doing anything has been that, well, it's actually Omicron is fading away, that that's not such a big problem. I spoke to somebody from South Africa this morning who told me, well, there's no more restrictions. I mean, some shops will ask you to put your, but otherwise, we're back to normal because Omicron is not causing any problems. What's your view about that?
Well, maybe that some countries are being able to get out from underneath it. I mean, there are, not everywhere it's the same, and in the U.S., we were clocking in 1,000 deaths per day since the end of August and more. Now we're more than that for sure. But, even before Omicron ever came here, we had people dying at a pretty good clip, certainly more per population than other places. And, both the exhaustion at the social level and individual level has a way of allowing a pandemic to actually, as I described earlier, act as water through cracks in ice. And Omicron, although it has been repeatedly bandied about or declared as a good thing that it'll sweep through and fall out, that might very well be the case. But even if Omicron, Delta is still circulating, and even if it were to go endemic, that doesn't mean that there aren't, examples from history of diseases going on for hundreds of years in an endemic way that are not nice, that they continue to be quite deadly. I think smallpox comes to mind, killing, 500 million people in 20th century alone. So there are, certainly, there are a variety of end games that this can come out. And one of them is, yes, we can be optimistic that Omicron will sweep through and it'll be over, enough people infected to keep other variants from coming about. I think we're all quite clear that this will continue to continue on, whether in the kind of epidemic phase of being very expansive and very aggressive, versus an endemic phase is one question. But an endemic phase doesn't necessarily mean everything is all good. And as we have been talking about this hour, certainly there are other pathogens that are waiting in the wings. And, to somehow the desire to wrap up the story misses a big issue that many of the things that brought about the pandemic have not been addressed yet. So whether this one continues on or another one, this is likely to call upon us to radically change things in a direction of protecting the social commons and health as a population phenomenon, and moving away from pretending that squeezing Earth for a buck is something that we can survive.
Yeah. Your essay on Patreon is, I understand, going to be, it's a draft of a chapter of your next book. Would you like to say just something about your next book, and which is going to be published by Monthly Review? It would be, I think, of interest to people to know about what you're writing about and when this is going to happen.
Yes, I'm glad you put me on the spot like that, because I do need to finish this thing already. And I'm down to one more essay, and it'll be done shortly, and it'll be about COVID in the Biden era. So a lot of what we talked about today, the notion that post-Trump we'd be okay is proven to be incorrect, and I will give chapter and verse on many of the ways in which much of the liberal paradigm actually recapitulates some of the denialism we see in the worst of the Trumpist anti-vaxxers. So I'm sure to make a lot of friends with it, both among liberals and Trumpists. I'm being facetious, of course, but I think it's incredibly important in this moment to speak directly and clearly and in the most direct terms possible, given our decisions that we, as we move forward, what to do about all this requires us to have a very clear understanding of where we're at. Well, so Rob, it should be out next year.
Next year, great. Well, we'll book you for another interview then, if not before. But Rob, thank you very much for sparing time to joining us. It's always incredibly stimulating to have you on this show. And also my thanks to the many people who have been following this and who have posted questions. We can't take any more at the moment, but really appreciate your having joined us today. So all the best to you and your family, and keep up the great work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I really appreciate your show, and I'll be happy to return. Thank you.
Many thanks. Okay, all the best. That was the great Amira Kir with lovely music, which she's very kindly let us have on the show. Thank you for all of you who participated, and I look forward to welcome you to our next show in due course. This is Firoz Manji saying bye-bye and thank you.